The easy, obvious thing to be said about Kill Switch, the point that's been made a million times prior to this video, is that it's a pretty clear predecessor to Gears of War. There's a lot of stuff in this game that you can draw a straight line from to things in Gears of War that would be done a few years later. But I think it's also interesting in the ways that it's different from Gears of War. Take, for example, the way that you're way more mobile in Kill Switch. Gears has this tendency to always have you being attacked by swarms of enemies in waves. You'll get to a combat arena, hunker down, and then fight some enemies before moving on. But Kill Switch is a lot more mobile. You spend a whole lot of time running through environments. Sure, there's a cover system and there's blind fire and that sort of thing, but you're moving from place to place in a much quicker fashion than you would in any modern cover-based third-person shooter. And that's helped in no small part by the fact that enemies are significantly weaker than you'd see in later games. Gears of War and its ilk had notoriously strong bullet sponges you could just empty an entire clip into. But Kill Switch's enemies feel more like you'd expect to see in the Xbox and PS2 era of the third-person shooter. And that's not the only way the game very much feels like a game stuck between generations. Besides the more rapid movement through areas, its cover system and shooting feels a whole lot like a game from the 360 generation that took cues from Gears of War, maybe on the level of a 50 Cent Blood on the Sand. But visually speaking, it is far from being a 360 game. In fact, in a lot of ways, it barely feels like it belongs on the original Xbox. Kill Switch has these big open areas, and as a trade-off, those areas can't be very detailed. In recent years, we've gotten very used to game worlds having an incredible amount of detail to them. And when I go back to older games, especially ones that had to make a trade-off in graphical detail for scope, it's really easy to see how far we've come. But being stuck between generations isn't always the greatest thing for this game. The checkpointing is almost non-existent. If you fail a level, you will likely have to replay a pretty large portion of that level again, much like you'd see in games of the time. The 360 era would bring with it better checkpointing, and these days we've gotten so used to that checkpointing that any shooter without them being properly spaced out feels absolutely archaic in comparison. In just about every other way, however, Kill Switch feels like a game far ahead of its time, and the rapidity with which you make your way through the levels is weirdly unique even today. It certainly has its problems beyond being hard to look at. Its story, which centers around the remote controlling of a soldier who is then eventually controlled by another person, is absolute pointless trash that I started completely skipping past once I got near the end of the game. But I think if you're coming to Kill Switch for the gameplay, you'll likely be pleasantly surprised, especially given the era. And I think it still has some unique things to offer all these years later. In my retro reviews, I look at games that came out at least 10 years ago, what I would consider to be retro, and see how they've held up today, if they're still worth playing now. If you like that idea, be sure to subscribe so you can see the latest videos. If you like this video in particular, be sure to hit that like button, and thanks for watching.